I love Father John Misty, huge Father John Misty fan. Of course, I'd name the obvious, like Kendrick Lamar, an artist like that, but there'd be nothing for me to do. It's perfect as it is. I can't imagine anything that I would bring to the table that would make that work any more perfect than it is. But of course, we all have these fantasies. Which brings up a point. A producer will often do her or his best work working with artists you don't think are perfect. If you think it's perfect, you're not going to add much of anything.
That's a good point.
But you think, yeah, there's room for me here. You're going to find the spot where you can make a contribution that is, as I said earlier, going to fan this thing out. Change its shape in a way that will be desirable. That's what you're looking for. How can I contribute something that is actually kind of needed? That's when you'll do your best work.
Yeah.
I think that's so applicable in any area in life. That's actually a really good lesson.
Yeah.
And Michelle asked another question. I know I'm throwing the wrong person here. Michelle asked another question that I wish I had come up with. I wish I had asked. How did you get interested in auditory memory? Like, where did that initial spark come from?
Well, I think it's when I studied it and I realized I have never, in any class I've taken in college, ever attempted to understand anything this difficult. Now, the difficult classes in college are going to be physics, and there'll be philosophy. Organic chemistry is really hard for many. Calculus is hard for some. There isn't a single thing I studied that was harder than memory. It is beastly difficult. One of the reasons why it's so difficult is because we think we know it. We think we know what memories are. But consider this for just a second. If I ask you to picture your bedroom when you were 10 years old, picture your bedroom when you were 10 years old. And if you follow the instruction and you do actually get a mental image of your bedroom, where the window was in relation to the bed, and if there were posters on the wall, or what the floor looked like, or where you kept your stuff, if you're picturing your room, what just happened? What just happened?
All kinds of neurons are firing, yeah.
Yes, but I planted the words bedroom, 10 years old. You have to be motivated. You were a willing spirit, let's presume, and you went ahead and thought of it. You reactivated a pattern of neural activity that crudely corresponds to your bedroom when you were 10 years old. So if you were sitting on your bed when you were 10, you'd be seeing certain things. And there'd be a pattern of activity that corresponds to what you're seeing. If that's going to be remembered later, that pattern needs to be tagged with a protein. It's actually called it's a kinase, alpha-calmodulin kinase, but it needs to be tagged with a protein so that you want it later, you can reactivate it. How that happens? Well, it takes place in the center of the brain, and it involves something called the entorhinal cortex, and it involves the hippocampus and all these little structures. But it takes a pattern, and your brain is going through this little process, and it's saying, remember this for later, and it's attaching proteins to that pattern, and then making it just kind of go away until you need it again.
Mm-hmm.
How that happens and how we can study thoughts in the brain is ridiculous. A thought has a physical correlate. It's a pattern of activity.
Yeah.
Think about the people that study physicality of thoughts, and you'll recognize just how difficult memory is. We can't. Yeah. You can't. You want to remember everything you learned in school, but you can't. You can employ certain tricks to try to remember it, mostly just like writing it down.
Yeah.
It's really hard to understand. And
it's fascinating stuff.
Geniuses who study it, yes.
I think probably one of my favorite subjects in college, because I was a psych major, was sensation and perception and cognition. And I could have spent whole days in that class, because I would spend time in that class, and it almost was in many ways a philosophy class, because you were thinking about thinking, and the metacognition behind metacognition even, and the ideas of like, well, everything that I'm sensing right now, is it real? Is it not real? Based on just the fact that these 5 senses are picking everything up, and then I'm, every single person has a different view of what's exactly going on. Like I said, I could have spent days in each of those classes because it just brought on so much thought and so much introspection. And it was one of my favorite classes of all time.
I like that sensation and perception too, and I just happened to have a great teacher in it, so it was especially good. I have an engineering mind, which makes me very attracted to neuroscience. I like thinking about systems and thinking about how things interconnect, and if you remove that one part, like how would it behave differently. I love systems. It's the kind of thinker I am. But other thinkers are more theoretical and philosophical. They're really, really smart, and I wish I was one of them. But I'm good with the neuroscience. That's kind of the street I live on a little bit.
So I have to ask, now that I've been hearing this conversation, Susan, do you do things in your lab like hook people up to fMRI and play different intervals and things like that, or is that something you'd like to do?
I do hook people up, but it's not to fMRI. Those tools just cost millions of dollars. Yeah. I'm at a teaching college, not at a research institution, so I don't have access to any of that fancy stuff.
EEG maybe? Or
Yes, that's what I have. I have EEG. And so I bring people into the laboratory, and they can sit in the comfy chair, and I can stick the electrodes, which is like a contact mic, and just stick it right here on the forehead for the ground wire, and then you stick 2 more on these bones. If you'll feel behind your ear, you'll feel there the mastoid bones right behind your ear. You can stick these electrodes there, and then you give people these really expensive etymotic earphones. And you have them sit back in the chair, and then they listen to, well, it can be a stream of clicks, or it can be tones or intervals, and this measures the auditory brainstem response. I can measure the output of the cochlea, and I can also measure what's going on in the cortex. I don't get much time for research for a couple of reasons. One is I'm at a teaching college, and they don't give us time for research. And I am getting kind of close to retirement now, so I'm just focusing on teaching and doing talks like these. And I travel a lot and talk about Prince and talk about music in the brain. And I'll get back into the lab this summer, and that'll be fun.
Very cool. Well, I'll have to see if I can. Do you have a Twitter or something where people can follow you and keep up with your research and your talks and such? Or?
No, being someone who's trying to find time for the laboratory, I do not have Facebook. I do not have Twitter. I do not have Instagram. I have zero participation in social media because I don't have anything I want to publish.
So people should just kind of Google your name and try and figure out what's going on with you next, and try and, because I don't know, I personally would love to keep up with what you're doing.
Well, that's nice to hear. Usually the way I get to talk about what I'm doing is with an invited talk. I just returned from Ottawa the weekend before last, where I participated in Megaphono, and I'll be giving... You've got a lot of talks coming up in March, and more in May. Some of them are in the United States, but some of them are in Canada and Australia and in Europe, and that's really, really, really fun for me. I get to talk about...
Oh, that sounds amazing, yeah.
that I've been researching or that I've been investigating. One of them is the neurobiology of creativity. I've been very, very excited about that, and I enjoy talking with other recording engineers and record producers about where our ideas come from, and what we're doing when we're listening to a performer play, and we're making this assessment about whether or not that performance is good enough, and whether or not that sound, that tone is good enough. And it's a constant running stream of judgment. Most of the time, it's no.
I'm familiar with that, yeah.
Here's the thing that you want, and then suddenly it crosses a psychological boundary and goes from no to yes. But where that boundary comes from is interesting to me, and also the fact that it's different for every individual brain. A perfect moment that illustrates this is in the great documentary Muscle Shoals. I can't get enough of watching that movie, but in the movie Muscle Shoals, the late, great Rick Hall, one of my absolute heroes of all time, would spend, according to Candy Stanton, would spend 3 days in the studio saying no, 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 no. Oh, and by the way, he's working with the Swampers. Like he's working at the same studio with the Swampers with some of the greatest rhythm sections ever to come out of anywhere on earth. And he's got this great talent. He's got Candy Stanton. He's got Percy Sledge. He's got these Aretha Franklin. He's got this great talent.
Yeah.
Why was it no for 3 days? What is he listening for? And that man, Rick Hall, single-handedly was turning out as many hits as Los Angeles and New York.
Yeah. Incredible.
Shoals, Alabama. Because his template for what good was so perfectly formed. When Greg Wells came to visit our campus here a few years back, I just love Greg Wells to death, and he was giving an open talk to the students, and he's talking about working with Katy Perry and what do they call 21 Pilots and all the many, many artists he works with. And he looked at our Berklee students and he said, you guys sitting here, you have no idea how good is. And I just nodded my head. Guys, school, wait till you get out there and you hear how good is. Wait till you work with a Tyler Stewart or a Jim Cregan or Greg Wells. Wait till you, Katie Lang. I recorded her once, and I'll never forget the sound that came out of her throat. She warmed up for 2 hours to do just 4 lines on a Wendy and Lisa album. I'd never recorded anything like that in my life. When that tone came up out of her chest and into that microphone.
Wow.
Yeah, you have no idea how good is. But good has to come from somewhere.
So there is another podcast that covers Barenaked Ladies. We're pretty good friends with them, and so it's all been done. And I asked them, I was like, "We're going to be talking with Susan this week. Do you have any questions?" And they sent me one. I'm going to do my best to read it because he also is a music geek over there. He says, I'd like to be curious to ask her about the volume wars of the mid-'90s, where every CD was mixed at the maximum volume possible, and whether you were pressured by your studio to do the same thing with Stunt, or if you felt it performed better at a reasonable level, and why. It was
the loudness wars, because volume and loudness are two different things.
Yes, the loudness wars. Nobody needed to pressure me. I'll tell you exactly what happened. So we would get test pressings for vinyl to check out, and you'd also get a test pressing for a CD. And with vinyl, in the 80s, we didn't have that loudness war going on. But by the time we got into the 90s, here's exactly what happens. You're a producer, right? And you've just received the test pressing of the band that you're very excited to have worked with, and you're anticipating that your single is going to be a hit. And you got that CD and you put it in your CD player, you set the volume to a comfortable level, you hit play, you listen to it, you assess it for how it sounds, and it sounds pretty good, great. You hit eject, you bring that cassette or that CD out of the drive, you put in someone else's CD just for comparison to make sure that, your judgment is correct, and theirs comes on louder. And what you do as a producer is you have your Scarlett O'Hara moment where you're shaking your fist at the sky going, God is my witness, this will never happen to me again. You want to be competitive.
Yeah.
And you, the band is calling you and they're asking, why isn't this loud enough? And you're saying, there's no excuse. It's on me. I blame myself. So the next time you mix, you start dialing up that stereo compressor, and you start asking your mastering engineer, crank it for me, I want it loud. We all did it, and it was an arms race. We all did it because we wanted our stuff to pop on radio in the 90s. And we know that people prefer things that are louder. When you compare to sound files, people will choose the louder one as being the better one. It took us a long time to dial that back, but it was really easy to get into and really, really hard to get out. The over squashing sounds terrible, and